Hey, how's it going? I hope the new year of 2023 is treating everyone well. Today I wanted to discuss three cues, concepts, tips that I use for the press handstand. And the difference is that these aren't the common ones. They're not the typical adjustments that you're going to hear all the time. They get into a little bit more of the detail, but I find the details are important. And I know personally I found these cues helped a lot with my own practice, and they've helped a ton with many students I've worked with. And these cues I think will help you either get your first press handstand, or if you already have it, they can help you refine it further to make it smoother, to make it take less energy, to make it look better, etc., etc. So don't want to talk too much as an intro, so let's get into it. All right, so the first tip is going to be try to get as round as possible when you're going into that press handstand. When you're in that bottom position and lifting up, the more round you can make your whole back, the better it's going to be. And it helps for a number of reasons. One, it helps to compress the body more. So for example, if I was just to use an example of my pancake flexibility, here, if I keep my back straight, it's a lot of hips. But if I use my spine, I can get closer to the floor and compress my body further. And the more compressed you're going to be, the less your shoulders have to move to displace that vertical line, the more efficient your press handstand is going to be. So that round back is really important in that regard. Now, talking about the shoulders, here's another benefit of rounding your back. So if my back is straight, the press handstand at the bottom requires a certain amount of forward shoulder lean depending on your level of technique and flexibility and proportions, right? So if I kept my back completely straight, that lean would have to come here with the shoulders, and when that happens, it becomes more of a planche movement, which means my shoulders travel further, my hips have to displace further off the center line, and it becomes less efficient and generally less aesthetic. However, if I can do some of that forward lean with my upper back instead of shoulders. Do you see the difference? How just moving my spine without changing my shoulder angle still changes my shoulders. If I can do that, it helps to make the press a lot more efficient, and it helps to conserve that push in the upper traps that's so important. So when you're in that liftoff position, as round as you can possibly be is going to be very helpful. And if you think you're doing enough, you're probably not. Try to get even more round. The more weight that you put on your hands, I see this with people a lot learning, as they start to extend a little bit. Try to stay as round as possible, because it's going to compress you more. It's going to help conserve your shoulder push, and it's going to make your press handstand look a lot better. And then another very important detail that will help you quite a bit in your press is learning how to use and how to roll the feet as you come up. So big mistake that I often see people make is they keep their feet flat and they don't articulate through the feet when they're lifting off. Now, of course, you can still learn a press handstand that way, but the feet make it so much easier, because look what happens when I'm standing flat-footed. Look what happens when I come up onto my toes. I get a few inches taller. If I can shift my hips a few inches higher before I even lift off the ground in my press handstand, that makes it a lot easier to lift off. It maintains my compression. It helps me keep the shoulder position without having to lean forward as far. It makes all the transitions smoother. So it's just one of those things that I didn't know that I was doing until years into doing it, but basically it just makes everything a lot smoother. And if you do it, it's going to help you a lot. So let's get into that demonstration. This is what I mean. So if I'm here in my liftoff position, I lean into the shoulders. If I keep my feet flat, it's much harder to get that lift off, because my hips are further away from my center line, and I want to stack my hips as soon as possible. So now watch what happens if I extend my toes. So I'm going to do two things. The first one is I'm going to go up into the balls of my feet, and as I continue leaning weight into the hands, I'm going to go up onto the toes as well. So what happens is I have to shift more weight further into my hands, but my hips also are shifting further up and forward where they want to be for that actual press handstand. So it just gets me closer without having to really change anything. So here versus here, do you see how I'm able to conserve that shape and keep a better shoulder push throughout when I go up onto my toes. So I think that's a very important cue that's often missed. And I use that cue for a lot of other exercises as well, especially when you have to be conscious of how much weight distribution you have between the hands and the feet. Because if I'm here, I can keep a lot of weight on my feet. If I'm here, I can still keep a lot of weight on my feet. If I'm up on the actual toes, I have to be shifting more weight into the hands, which means I'm going to be closer to lifting my feet off the ground. It also means I'm going to be building more strength. And one other kind of tip, drill that I like to use for this is here, I lean the weight into the hands, I push, and I drag the toes a little bit as light as possible just to feel what that lift off is, and feeling how, because my hips are further up, I can get more compression and I can make the movement more efficient. So definitely don't forget to be using your feet when you do your press handstand. And the final concept for today is the idea of hips forward. I find that to be personally one of the most helpful cues for me when I was trying to improve my stalder press and do multiples. That helped me so much because that hips forward helped me conserve not only the shoulder push but also the general compression of the body as well. So what does that mean? Basically, it's like this. If I'm here, unless I'm very flexible and have very specific proportions between my arms, legs, and torso, probably I'm not going to be stacked in my press lift-off position. What does that mean? It means the hips are not on top of the hands. If the hips are on top of the hands, then we're more or less in a handstand, and then we don't have to do a lot of shoulder compensation in order to lift the legs up. But more than likely, for most of you watching, wherever I am here, my hips are not on top of my hands, they're behind my hands. So, if I were to try to lift my hips up, depending on how I cue that, is going to make a big difference of what happens and what it looks like. So if my hips are really far behind and I don't change anything, I lean my shoulders forward, it becomes very much a planche, and my hips are still really far behind. If I lift my hips up, there's a certain point at which I'm still going to lean my shoulders forward. So this is the concept and the cue that I find helped me the most. And again, I've used it with a lot of students as well. I'm trying to make my hips go forward, not just up. Because if my hips go up, my shoulders are still going to go forward. What I don't want in the press, or what I want to minimize, is the amount of this. The further the shoulders are off the center line, the less of a handstand I'm in, the more work it's going to take, and the movement's going to be less efficient and less smooth, unless you're specifically trying to do a planche press to handstand, which I consider just a completely different movement. So, what I'm trying to do, my hands are here, I'm trying to make my hips go over there. I'm trying to get to this point where my arms are vertical, my hips are actually in front of the hands to counterbalance the legs, which are down. It may not always look like that, it may not manifest in that way, but if I watch the difference between these two presses, see how they look, I'm not really warmed up, but if I lift my hips up, then my shoulders go forward, right, try not to hit that wall. But if I think about my hips going forward, I can actually compress further, and not only compress further, but just make the movement more smooth, more efficient, and not lean forward as far in my shoulders. So the hips forward. So see what happens when when I think about my hips traveling forward, I'm pushing even more with the shoulders because I want to get that extension, and it actually helps me find that stack a lot sooner. So again, it may not actually happen, what I described. You have to understand this difference between intent versus manifestation, but I find if I think about my hips going forward, that helps the most with all of these other cues in terms of how to push, how to compress, etc., etc. So think about that next time you're pressing, next time you're lifting up. Make your hips go forward. Keep your shoulders pushed out. As always, it's just my perspective on the skill. It's not meant to be the ultimate guide or the ultimate authority. I'm just sharing a few things that I found useful based on my experience and observations and teaching. So if it is useful for you, give the video a thumbs up. Let me know in the comments below what you think and if it's helpful, and let me know what else you'd like to see on this channel. Other than that, I'll see you next time.